Long days and pleasant nights, fellow travelers along the path of the beam. I am known in this realm as Jaime in Fuego, and if it please you, join me and let us hold palaver here for another special presentation from the horror show and in Fuegotainment entitled The Road to the Dark Tower movie. Shout out to Mr. Bev Vincent, who inspired this segment with his book The Road to the Dark Tower, and this is covering our fourth entry in the series. That's right, Wizard and Glass, as you see right above here. And I know when I was reviewing on the 19th of last month, and this is the 19th of April when you were seeing this, when I was reviewing The Wasteland, I believe that I mentioned it might be my favorite entry in the entire series, and it was really just flip a coin between that one and between Wizard and Glass. But just to give you guys a little context, I am a Stephen King fanatic who, when I realized about 7-8 years ago that all of his stuff interlocks, or at least a good portion of it, I started buying and reading his entire collection in its published order. So I started with Carrie, despite the fact that I'd already read stuff like Salem's Lot, Pet Sematary, It, The Stand, you know, ones that everybody loves and with good reason because it's some of King's best work. El Rey, as I like to call him. But the journey is nearly through, and the reason I even started this journey in the first place was because I knew so many of these things were going to tie into The Dark Tower, his magnum opus, and I am rereading the entire series once a month leading up to the theatrical The Dark Tower, starring Matthew McConaughey as the Man in Black and Idris Elba as the Gunslinger. That's right, Mr. Roland Deschain. And yeah, the movie has been moved to August now. I believe it's August 4th, if I'm not mistaken now. It was basically just shifted up 1 week from its original late July release. And so let's talk about what I have officially decided after rereading it is my favorite book in the entire Dark Tower series. Now, maybe things will change when I reread 5, which I really liked. 6, I'll admit I wasn't the biggest fan of, and 7 had some points, but, and I'm also going to be doing a special review of 2 other offshoots, which are The Wind Through the Keyhole, which many consider 4.5. I believe King even described it as such, but I'm also doing a Little Sisters of Eulalia video as well, so stay tuned for both of those bonus videos. But we're covering entries proper here on the 19th, and Wizard and Glass, I decided after rereading it, I love so much and is my favorite of the series for the sheer fact that it really does encompass everything that a Dark Tower fan like me adores. So one of the things I loved so much about the first book, about the Gunslinger, was the storytelling aspect and the fact that we caught up with Roland in, you know, the world that has moved on as he wanders through Midworld, and, you know, after the Man in Black, after Walter, or, you know, Martin, or Farson, or, you know, Randall Flagg, whatever the hell he calls himself, you know, in all of his different iterations and disguises and, you know, cloak and dagger craziness. But I love the fact that we also got some of Roland's childhood, and that is something that this book balances so beautifully, is the fact that when we join our characters, you know, our new quartet, as we call them, Oi, and Susanna, and Eddie Dean, and Jake from, you know, New York, Mr. Chambers, and then obviously Roland, they are still on Blaine the Mono after, you know, escaping Lud. And so King even mentions in the afterword how pissed he knew his fans were, because of the fact that for the first time with The Wastelands, the third book, he left you on a cliffhanger, and then he waits like 6 years from 91 to 97 to actually release a new entry. So he was busy doing stuff like, you know, Insomnia, where he really developed his main big bad even more so, and really kind of introduced him after all the hints of, you know, the red eyes, you know, that they see painted all over various areas, you know, as they progress down the path of the beam. But yeah, it's interesting that he took so much time to tie in other things together into the Dark Tower, from, you know, doing stuff like, oh goodness, not Gerald's Game, but, you know, Rose Matter, the one that came right after Insomnia, and that tied directly in with Desperation and Regulators, and that even had some dimensional jumping themes, which we really properly covered in The Wastelands. But it becomes even more full circle in The Dark Tower, Wizard and Glass, because after finally escaping Blaine the Malo Mano, I'm going to call him the bad monorail. Yeah, it's just really interesting. I guess that's a slight spoiler, but you probably expected that they were there has to be a story, and the riddling, which we ended stuff with in the Wastelands, it finishes up, so we're brought right up to speed, and yet we make it to Topeka, Kansas, but we're not exactly in Kansas anymore, in all honesty, because it is a different Kansas that seems to have been hit by a plague, the same very plague or contagion, virus spreading throughout, which was in The Stand. And when I first read this book, I still remember being just jumping for joy when you're seeing more references to, the flu that kills everybody, and, little stuff about, like Fear the Walking Dude and, Hail the Crimson King and stuff. So it was the older, The Stand maybe being my favorite Stephen King book ever, and possibly favorite adaptation. If you guys refer back to my top 3 video, I know that I mentioned that. But this was just multiverses all culminating together, and the fact that we have so many hints and Easter eggs about The Stand. But the interesting thing is, after we get past that point in the initial portion, that's where we sit down when Roland encounters a thinny with the quartet, and a thinny is basically an area where it's thin enough for trans-dimensional jumping, and yet you don't know what overlapping multiverses could be there. So the Dark Tower, basically, as you may or may not know if you guys are tuning into this video for the first time, I'm not sure why you're jumping right into book 4, but maybe you've read the first 3 and you want some better explanation, or you're just having me catch you up for the movie, which is supposed to be an amalgamation of many aspects of all the different books. They're kind of cherry picking, which I have mixed feelings about, but that's for another video in another day. It's just fascinating to see the fact that all of these multiverses connect to the tower, and that's almost like the piece that's holding everything together in every infinite dimension, from our world to worlds that are very similar to it. Like the whole thing with The Stand, there's a virus that goes throughout the world, and this Topeka they find themselves in is a very similar world, but it's more like a mirror world, almost like with the thinny, or excuse me, with the twinny, jumping aspect that was in, the Talisman, and then later on Black House. And so it's they find themselves in a Topeka that is almost identical to ours, but there's a couple nuances that Eddie and Jake especially pick up on quite quickly, where they're like, wait, this isn't exactly our iteration of the United States, or whatever it's moved on to at this point. And so this thinny invokes immediately a recollection of something that Stephen King hinted at. And this is one of my only gripes with the guy, is that he does foreshadow stuff a little too much sometimes, and he did a tiny bit about what's going to transpire in the bulk of Wizard and Glass in earlier iterations, waking up screaming about Susan and about Rhea of the Coups and stuff. So he had these notes already written about characters that were going to become big time in Wizard and Glass, and I'm not sure if he even had initially intended on explaining them to the bulk that he had, but after 6 years of waiting, the story that Roland tells, it's the basis of the book, and yet as much as I adored, getting off Blaine and exploring, stuff that ties very directly to The Stand, and as much as I love The Stand and how great it was, I like the flashback story even better. Fascinating thing about this flashback story that encompasses, the predominance of this book is that it was done by Marvel Comics in an approach that really just showed the gunslinger and his earlier years. It was called The Gunslinger Born. It introduced him to a whole new generation of, younger readers, maybe even older ones that still read comics that just were not that familiar with the books, but yet they like Stephen King. The art by Jai Lee was incredible. The overseeing by Robin Firth, who is King's lead historian, who did the Dark Tower Encyclopedia, both versions of it actually. The updated one after the one through the keyhole stuff comes in. And so, damn, I just have to say that I love this story. It's really about love. It's about the gunslinger's first love, and with the exception of the woman that he meets briefly in The Little Sisters of Eluria, the only woman that he ever felt something significant for. I mean, when he was in tall, and he was like banging down the bar wench or whatever. And so we get the vibe that, and also later on in Dark Tower 6 and 7, or maybe it's just 7, where the woman helps him along the road, the rich lady he kind of holds captive. But long story short, Roland is really revealed to be a scarred, just not so much a hopeless romantic, but one that really does love genuinely and deeply. And so the story that he tells after they encounter this thinny and they camp beside it is about how after he passes his gunslinger test with Court, and how he now has his guns and he's ready to rock it. There's so much other stuff going on behind the scenes with Martin not being there, who Stephen Deschain, his father, already kind of has a vibe, is either going to turn on him, already has. He's aware of what's going on with his wife, Roland's mother, obviously, with Martin. And this is a fascinating book even beyond all the stuff with the kids, because it really pulls the curtain back a lot further in giving you information about the conflict and the politics of what was going on, obviously in Gilead, but with the entire affiliation, which we kind of are led to believe is the old, more powerful kingdoms and sorts, in world and midworld and whatnot. But there is John Farson, the good man, who wants to just overthrow all of them, and he's doing it through brutal means, but he's justifying it because he's alleging that these kingdoms are tyrannies and so on and so forth. And so just getting more of that insight into what was really going on when Roland was an adolescent and maturing, and much more quickly than he was probably ever thought to. It's just, I find it awesome. He is sent away with 2 of his best friends, which is Elaine and Cuthbert, who we met briefly in the first book. And he is sent for kind of safety's sake to the barony of Mejis, and then there's also Hambry, and they're like connected right by each other. This is one aspect of the geological stuff that I really need to research a little bit more proper. I kind of got the vibe that Mejis was the more farm surrounding, or maybe like the state, or the province or territory or whatever, and then Hambry is the more centralized place where the mayor is, and where the people in power reside, and like the more city area with the rule of Mejis surrounding it. So any of you fellow King aficionados who want to clarify for me about this proper, which I should have done before filming this video, but I just finished reading this monster just yesterday on the 18th. And that's another thing to mention, is that this is almost 700 pages compared to the first, which was only a couple hundred, and then 2 and 3, which were in the 400 range. King knew that he had to make up for lost time, and that's why he makes this so massive. And so yeah, our 3 young gunslingers basically are sent to this rural area to kind of keep face like they're counting livestock and things like that for the affiliation, and for all their people back in Gilead and whatnot. But they're really just kind of spies that are conveniently in safety. And so there's a lot going on behind the scenes in Mejis and Hambry, and it's once again, I just keep coming back to the word fascinating because of so much more that we learn about the state of the world at the time, or at least Roland's world. But there's also at the very heart of all of this a story of love amongst a young man and a young woman, and also amongst friends, because Roland meets a girl named Susan Delgado, beautiful blonde, who has been promised to the Mayor Thorin, of this particular province or area or what have you. And so he has a wife that can't bear children for him. And so when we first meet Susan, she's going to meet this wicked witch of the barony, this Rhea of the Coos, who, it's also interesting that they make so many parallels throughout this book with The Wizard of Oz and also Romeo and Juliet. We have quotes from both of them right at the very beginning of this book. And so, man, we fall in love with Susan immediately. She's brash, she's cute, she's singing, Careless Love when she's first walking up to meet the witch, who's basically going to give her a little check and make sure that she is pure and a virgin, I guess, to put it more bluntly, before she goes to bed with this mayor. And she is not excited about it, but her father was killed under mysterious circumstances. Her aunt is raising her now, and at the behest of her aunt, she has agreed to, go to bed with the mayor, bear him a child, and that is allegedly going to be the end of it, but she's suspect. And so we also meet a couple of guys called the Big Coffin Hunters, who right before Susan arrives, they are kind of the big bads along with this witch in the story, and we know pretty much right away that they are agents of Farson, that they have teamed up with the sheriff and with the mayor and the leaders in the barony here because they are trying to set some stuff up behind the scenes, and yet they're trying to save face all at the same time with the affiliation. And so creates an interesting contrast and dynamic when Roland meets this girl. They immediately have chemistry, and yet she has to keep it secret. And so that's where the Romeo and Juliet thing really comes into play, because they're star-crossed lovers, Roland and Susan, and it was done amazingly in the book. It's done beautifully in the Marvel comic, despite the fact that they streamlined a few story aspects. They did a great job of recreating the conflict between these big coffin hunters, which are named Jonas, DePape, and Reynolds. So it's a trio of these bandit-type guys who are almost like the anti-gunslingers, you know, these agents of Farson that are kind of keeping their allegiances, you know, under the table and, you know, kind of incognito. And so it just really turns into an interesting cat and mouse game between our little coffin hunters, as they are described, which is Cuthbert, Elaine, and Roland, as they butt heads with the big coffin hunters, and as these investigations are going to play. They describe it in the book as a game of castles, where you know that there's a conflict and yet there's so much shrouded in secrecy. Damn, is it just so well done. I'm especially fascinated because when Ron Howard was first trying to develop The Dark Tower into a series of movies, he had said that he was going to approach the bulk of the fourth book, and much like the Marvel Comics, combine it with the younger stuff from The Gunslinger and turn that into a television series that he envisioned being on one of the pay networks, you know, either HBO, Showtime, possibly Starz, or, you know, who knows, one of the others that could jump in, you know, maybe like a Sci-Fi or an FX or, you know, an AMC or whatever. But it's still apparently on the table, despite this new, you know, director coming on, Nicolas Arcel, if I'm remembering off the top of my head. And so they're still saying that the plan is, after this first film, to have a television series that tells this fascinating, exciting story of the gunslinger when he is first, you know, just getting his ears wet with conflict and, you know, trying to investigate what is going on with these forces of Farson that are, you know, they have something to do with Mejis and, you know, with this barony there. And so as the love blossoms, there's unfortunately some issues with, you know, Roland and the other two in his quartet. But eventually, just a different affiliation and, I guess, union and partnership is formed, a different quartet, a younger quartet that involves a great bar hand named Shimi, who shows up in the comics as well. And there's also stuff that needs to be mentioned about the Wizard's Glass, which the ancient sorcerer wizard Merlin, which, if we're going way back to the Arthur Eld stuff, they touch upon it in this, and they also touch upon Merlin a little bit more so in 4.5 in The Wind Through the Keyhole. But there were apparently, just like with all the different markers on the ends of the Path of the Beam, there were different orbs or, you know, just glowing prophetic type balls of energy of sorts that allow you to see into the past, into the future, into, you know, they are so very powerful. And the one that we encounter in this is the grapefruit, the pink ball. And you can't really see it on this particular cover as well, but I'll make sure to overlay something here where you can really see just the importance and the basis of this crystal ball, that it causes a lot of conflict. It causes a lot of crap to go down because the big coffin hunters give it to Rhea at first, but it's almost like a dangerous glamour that draws you in and you become hypnotized by it and the power by it and all the things that it allows you to see, but it will definitely drain the life from you. And so this actually gives insight into various things that are transpiring, you know, back in this flashback world that, you know, Roland is telling Eddie and Jake and Susanna and, you know, Oi, from what he can comprehend about. And so if you've read the previous three entries, or if you've read this before, you know that things don't necessarily end the way Roland wants them to. And without spoiling things, he also, when he peers into this orb for the first time, he makes a choice that reverberates through the rest of his life, however long it is, you know, because all of these thinnies are popping up everywhere because of the fact that the Dark Tower, all of the beams are being broken by these pushers. The fact that thinnies are showing up everywhere because the tower that holds all the fabrics of all these alternate universes and you know, dimensions and all of reality together, thinnies are becoming more prevalent because of the fact that that fabric is crumbling and that you know, that groundwork and that foundation is in danger of being completely destroyed. And so we get a few references to Flag, including one very interesting appearance by him in the flashback. But does he eventually pop up in the end once Roland has told his tale? You're going to have to read to find out. There's also another character that may or may not from the third book show up. And this is where it's so tough because I want to just talk about more of those connotations between the Wizard of Oz or between you know, there's even some Charles Dickens references that are pretty dope. I mean, basically Roland tells his story in what seems like one night, but since the world has moved on, the perception of time is kind of strange, as they say all the time, because Eddie is like, have you been talking for hours or for days? You know, what's going on, Roland? And, you know, Jake obviously is like, the spirits did it all in one night! And so, yeah, there's one of your references, but Rhea of the Coos, there's parallels between her and the Wicked Witch of the West, and I just love the dynamic and the brotherhood of the three in the original younger quartet for Roland. Elaine is interesting because he is more level-headed, and he's maybe more so like Jake in that aspect because he has an essence of the touch as well, which is kind of like a psychic premonition type thing. But then you definitely see why Roland has seen similarities throughout between Eddie and between Bert, you know, Mr. Cuthbert, Mr. Algood, and it's really fascinating and fun, and I love the snarkiness of Bert, and I love the level-headed, interesting, just kind of thought-provokingness of Elaine. I mean, those younger characters are tremendously cool and just so fun to read, and that is why I love this more than any other Dark Tower book, because it's the best of both worlds. It's the world with the newer quartet, where you see their love and just they tie it in with so many other later Stephen King books, but then they go back and they explore the backstory and the history of Roland when he was a kid, when he was really being developed into a man, and it's just, it's got a little bit of everything, and it's also brutal when it wants to be, and when the thinny comes into play and trying to drive some of Farson's forces towards it, and there's so many references to the fact that Roland's world is very similar to ours, one of those close iterations, you know, that where it's almost like a mirror of ours, like when I was making the Stand comparison, but since time has moved on, we are so many centuries or however long ahead because there are old machines and, you know, gasoline rigs like Sitco and stuff like that, so you know that it's almost like new dark ages, like the Bad Religion song, came back. You know, so we had all this technology, you know, from the old ones and so on and so forth, and then this horrible catastrophe happened, whether it was nuclear war or whether it was a plague or a virus or whatever, or flu strain that spread across, or, you know, whatever it may have been, the world moved on. The world was destroyed, and so it's just, for guys like me who like alternate universes and things tying together, it is brilliant, my friends, and for anyone who knows the heartbreak of what char you tree, it still kills me every time I read it, whether it's in the comic form or whether, you know, rereading it here in the Wizard and Glass novel proper. It's just crushing, and yet it is such an emotional book, such a fun book. I cannot sing its praises enough. It is just, damn, it's tremendous. And the cast of characters is fascinating, and, you know, the old world politics and everything. Definitely the anti, you know, drawing of the three for me, and the fact that it doesn't deal with our world really at all. And that was one of my only gripes about the second book, was that so much time was spent with the jumping back and forth. I know some people enjoy it. It's not my favorite, and now you see why, because of the fact that I enjoy this one so very much. So yes, guys, this was very far from a bum hug for you know, anyone who catches the reference. This is my favorite book in the Dark Tower series. I adore Wizard and Glass. That's nearly 700-page monster that came out in 1997. So I urge all of you to check it out. I'm hopeful that we're going to get that TV series. They're still saying that it's going to come, but as with anything Dark Tower, with delay after delay, and with, everything else, I will remain skeptical, but hopeful. And that is where the journey ends, at least for now, fellow friends and constant readers. I do hope that we have been well met. I must extend a grande gracias once again to Vincent, the peeps at Cemetery Dance, and anyone who is a lover of King that publishes his work and helps us just enrich ourselves with his awesomeness. Obviously to El Rey, Mr. Stevie K, the King, damn Rizal, and just these amazing stories, even beyond the Dark Tower, that he has given us that have enriched our lives and just really made us think and made us feel. I adore them oh so very much. I have been Jaime and Fuego. You can always find me on Twitter predominantly, but also Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. I am relaunching my YouTube on a different page called Infuegotainment because I've been on my Jaime and Fuego moniker for a while, and also it's a 2-year anniversary of when I started doing that sort of film coverage aside from the horror show. So May 1st, look forward to the relaunch of the hottest entertainment with an edge at youtube.com/Infuegotainment. And I look forward to more of these videos on the 19th of every month leading up to the release of the film. So next month, May 19th, we are going to have Wolves of the Kala, which for me was the last really, really good Dark Tower book, but who knows, maybe my opinion will change with rereading. This will be my first time rereading it since the initial go-through. So another thing to keep in mind is that King wrote 5, 6, and 7 all in a row after his accident, and my initial thoughts were that he, as opposed to giving the books the time they needed in between to simmer and settle properly, I felt like maybe some things were forced and rushed a little bit. Perhaps I will think differently. I'm hopeful that I will, but that is not to say that I don't love the last 3 Dark Tower entries. I'm excited to bring you those, special offshoots of Little Sisters of Eulalia and obviously Wind Through the Keyhole. You can look forward to those in between now and the 19th of May. But until the next 19th comes around as the Wheel of Ka circles, I must extend a grande gracias once more, say hasta luego, sin amigos. I hope that it is sooner rather than later, and until that day comes, hail to Stephen King, returning on its usual time this upcoming Sunday. Stay scared. And obviously, read Stephen King.